is, what is the soil of our spirit like? Is it open to the seed of God's word? From the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 1 to 9, 18 to 23. At about the same time Jesus left the house and sat on the beach. In no time at all, a crowd gathered along the shoreline, forcing him to get into a boat. Using the boat as a pulpit, he addressed his congregation, telling stories. What do you make of this? A farmer planted seed. As he scattered the seed, some of it fell on the road, and birds ate it. Some fell on the gravel. It sprouted quickly, but didn't put down roots. So when the sun came up, it withered just as quickly. Some fell on the weeds. As it came up, it was strangled by the weeds. Some fell on good earth and produced a harvest beyond his wildest dreams. Are you listening to this? Really listening? Study this story of the farmer planting seed. When anyone hears news of the kingdom and doesn't take it in, it just remains on the surface. And so the evil one comes along and plucks it right out of that person's heart. This is the seed the farmer scatters on the road. The seed cast in the gravel, this is the person who hears and instantly responds with enthusiasm. But there is no soil of character, and so when the emotions wear off and some difficulty arrives, there's nothing to show for it. The seed cast in the weeds is the person who hears the kingdom news, but weeds of worry and illusions about getting more and wanting everything under the sun strangle what was heard, and nothing comes of it. The seed cast on good earth is the person who hears and takes in the news, and then produces a harvest beyond his wildest dreams. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Good morning. The St. Peter's Music Scholars Program was the idea of Don and the late Margaret Walter. Its intentions is for inspiring musical youth by providing them the opportunity to perform for a diverse audience, while enriching our worship and supporting our outreach. Today, Bethany Duketow of Lakefield will be performing How Great Thou Art on piano. Bethany comes from a large and very talented family, 9 children in all, and I would just like to have Mom and Dad wave to us if they don't mind. There. I think we'll get to know this name, Duketow, because they are all very talented, and we're hoping that they'll be part of our church service for years to come. Bethany started playing piano when she was very young, and very recently completed her level 10 practical piano exam through the Royal Conservatory of Music. Bethany has performed many times at festivals and at her church in Lakefield. We welcome Bethany and her family to St. Peter's today.
These masks are fun to deal with, aren't they? Oh, gosh. There was a minister that had this text, and he wanted to try and teach his parish about what it was to have good soil in your life, in your heart, that informs you. And so he brought into his church for the sermon 3 jars, or actually 4 jars. And he put a worm in each jar. And in one jar with one worm, he filled it up with a bottle of wine and put the lid on. And in the second jar, he lit a cigarette and dropped it in and put the lid on, enough that it kept on smoldering. And then in the third jar, he grabbed a bottle of chocolate syrup and squeezed all the syrup into the jar with the worm, and then put the lid on. And into the fourth jar, he just put in good, clean soil. As he walked through his reflection, he talked a little bit about what Jesus wanted to teach and how he wanted to get people's attention, and then he looked at the 3 jars. The worm had died with the cigarette, with the alcohol, and the chocolate. But in the soil, that worm was still there and healthy. And he asked the members of his congregation if they had any idea about what the lesson here was. And a lady at the back of the church stood up and said, "Yes, if you smoke, if you drink, if you like chocolate, you won't get worms." That wasn't the point. And so let me get my notes here so that I can make my point. But today, Jesus is teaching from a boat. I won't take time to get out there and get anchored and preach in through the church windows, but Jesus was trying to go where the people were and talk to them in a plain way and really make sure they got a good understanding of what God is, of who Jesus is. And Jesus starts by saying, there's a man throwing seeds everywhere, and the seeds are given without caution, care, or worry about where more will come from. That's God. God is so generous that no matter the condition of your heart, where you fall within those soils, the seeds will come to you. But the growth, that's relative to you. I don't know if you caught the word heart in that reading, or if that reading made you think of your heart. But in the Hebrew tradition, the heart is something that is central. The heart is where your soul lives. The heart is your spirit. The heart is the mind, but more. It's the place where our striving for goodness, our longing comes from. If we look in the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes tells us God puts longings in our heart. Eternity is in our heart. Knowledge of our own life and limits is there. And Jesus warns us as well. He said, evil intentions come from a corrupted heart. Watch what someone says from their mouth. You'll know what they're thinking and what they're feeling. The heart can't be hidden from God. Remember that line, that the law is inscribed on your heart? It knows what is good. Interestingly, Jesus also tells us in the Gospels that forgiveness, true forgiveness, only comes from the heart. And in Matthew, there's this line, take heart, which to me means that courage comes from our hearts. What is your heart like? Is it hard ground? Is it shallow soil with a little bit of rocks? Are there big weeds there that are choking out other things? Or is it good soil? What are the paths we're on? At different places in our lives, we could be either or any of those, or maybe an amalgam of all of them. But Jesus wants us to remember that a hard heart, or a heart that's oblivious like a rocky path, is a barren wasteland. we're hard, we're bitter, not much is going to grow there. A shallow soil or a rocky path or a road that's being walked down has a little bit of fertility in it, but it's troubled, it's compacted. Only shallow roots can grow that aren't going to sustain much. If our lives full of weeds, the weeds are going to choke out the good growth. It's like having clover in your lawn at home. As much as you want to get that clover out, it just chokes all the other grass and becomes what's there, unless you want to dig it all out and work it up. But a fertile heart, good soil, will sustain life and give life. Isn't that what this lake is to all of us who paddle its shores, swim in its waters, or just listen to the ripples along the shoreline? I don't know, maybe a boat engine is something that does that for you, but each of us will have something that we draw from this lake. And hopefully it's something that makes us go deeper. There was a story about a man who was a tour guide in Florida in an orange growing county. And he was taking someone around an orange grove, and the trees were starting to wither. And the man said, the pump here on this farm, the irrigation pump's not working, and the trees are really suffering from the lack of water. But come over to my farm, I'll show you what a farm looks like. We've got a little bit better conditions here. So they went over, and this farm looked great, but the man wasn't watering. And he said, well, what's your secret? And he said, well, my trees can go 2 weeks without rain, because when they were young, I didn't overwater them. I wasn't interested in getting a quick crop, and I let them put their roots down deep where they could find the nutrients they needed. Hardship in life is often a cause for despair, but hardship is also a condition for growth. As the trees searched for moisture, how do we use the hardship in our lives, or the challenges, or those opportunities for growth, to grow deeper? We think about Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount talking about the Beatitudes. Blessed are they who search for righteousness, mourn, care for others, who open their lives up to the world. There's something interesting there. When things are broken, when we break open ourselves, things happen, rather than if we just sort of close in and hold ourselves tight. For a crop to grow, the soil has to break open so the seed can be planted. As some of us witnessed this past week, for the rain to come, the clouds need to break open, bringing their moisture. How do you get bread? You got to crack the grain. How do we break bread as a family when we're sitting around the table? When we break bread and share it, we take that nutrients and that energy into ourselves. And I'd even go so far to say that as Jesus' disciples wept at his death, we see Peter's weeping, remembering his failing 3 times, remembering the struggles. Peter came to a place of greater power because he drew humility into himself, and he saw that service was a gift, and it was something that God walked with him on. It wasn't just his own thing. Trials teach us what we are. Trials dig up the soil and let us see what we're made of. Sometimes we don't even know what we're made of. I heard a story about in the 1840s about how 2 young men from Germany came to the United States. The older one was a little bit of a cook and loved making sauerkraut. And he knew that the West Coast was emerging as a new center and wanted to go and start a little restaurant there. The younger brother, with no skill or profession or no clue, ended up in a mining school in Colorado, and then he went to see his brother. As the older and the younger brothers got together, the older was proud of his business, and he showed him around his property where he had his garden and where his little restaurant cafe was as he served the community and sold his wares. The younger brother stopped listening to his older brother and put his hands down in the soil and started to hold it in his hands and rub it around. And the older one got upset. He said, "You're not interested in what I'm doing. You're not respecting me as your older brother. You should be paying attention. Look at all that I've accomplished." And his younger brother was rolling the rocks around in his hands. And the older brother said, "Oh, those are just quartz." And the younger brother said, "Yes, but in this quartz there's gold." And the younger brother had the first find of the El Dorado gold rush in California that happened in '45. The younger brother had been there. He'd been growing a crop, but he missed out on the richness that was in that soil because he was doing his thing and only doing his thing and keeping focused on his thing. Are the things that you're focused on the things you need to be focused on? I heard this story. I'm not sure if it's to do with the mythical Camelot and whether it's King Arthur or whether it was his wise tutor. But I heard a story about a tutor and a young student who were walking through a forest. And the tutor stops and points to 4 different things. He points to a tiny sprout, and then a firmly rooted plant, and then a small shrub, and then a big tree. And the tutor says to the young person, "Pull out that little sprout." Pulls it out, 2 fingers, lays it on the ground. Comes to the firmly rooted plant, a little bit of a weed, and he used one hand and was able to pull it out. And then he got to the bush. "Remove that as well." And this young person said, "I don't want to be a gardener, but I'll listen to my tutor." And he needed 2 hands, and it took a lot of work moving it around, getting the roots loose, and he pulled it out. And then finally, as he got to the tree, it was so big around, it was 1.5 feet in diameter, couldn't even move it. The tutor said to the young man, "What are you learning here? What do you need to know?" And he said, "I know there's a message, but it's not coming. Can you tell me?" So it is with bad habits. When they're caught easy and early, they're able to be removed. But bad habits and poor choices, when they're left rooted in our soil, will continue to grow. While things are little and easy to cast out, it benefits us to be tilling and managing the soil so that the good things can grow and so that the things that don't need to grow are taken from those spaces. As we gather on this lake, as we gather here in God's house to remember how great and how big and how beautiful God is and about the capacity for growth within us, I pray that we'll all take a little bit of time to take from our bodies the things that transform the soil into the harder, more resistant places and allow it to become that holy ground that God's seed can be planted in and yield unlimited growth. I pray a blessing on us all that these waters may restore, renew, and give life in God's name.